The Salvadoran people break your heart with their amazing capacity to maintain hope in the face of situations which seem almost hopeless.
I do this work primarily out of political and moral reasons because of my moral repugnance at the vile role that our government had in conducting, paying for, and training the soldiers who were involved in the war here in El Salvador and the atrocities that they committed.
The story of the Salvadoran people is one of deep social injustice. It really begins with the coming of the Spanish, and the Spanish initiated a hacienda system, creating slaves who would work these haciendas. The whole history is one of a process of marginalizing people, of pushing them off the land. This leads to poverty, enslavement, right up until around the 1850s when the US comes in and says this is our back door, the Monroe Doctrine and all that, and the Spanish are out. The US comes in, with the land remaining in the hands of the same people, now at the behest of the United States. What finally happens is the coming of a revolution. This is like the 1970s and late 60s, and people began to organize, and it began with some very simple demands. I mean, it began basically by saying that we get one plate of beans and one tortilla, and we need two to survive. And they were met with a violent repression. And understand that there's a military dictatorship that's supported by the United States, where the U.S. sees any attempt at social change, no matter how modest, as being driven by Soviet Union.
Mientras la gente estaba sentada frente a la calle haciendo una protesta, los cuerpos de seguridad como la Guardia Nacional, como la Policía de Hacienda, capturaban a la gente, se la llevaban a la cárcel. Los que buena suerte tuvieron fueron a la cárcel. Muchos de esos fueron desaparecidos, otros fueron torturados y otros fueron asesinados. En mi caso fui capturada 2 veces. En lo personal yo perdí mis padres, 2 hermanos, y esos son parte de los sacrificios que a muchos nos ha tenido que pasar.
Me incorporé porque la represión me obligó a hacerlo. Entonces era una necesidad de vida. Si no me incorporaba, igual me mataban. Entonces tenía que aprender a defenderme y a defender a los míos. Entonces fue una necesidad.
All this struggle eventually leads to a civil war beginning about 1979. And what complicates this, what really becomes a tragedy, is the election of Ronald Reagan. Reagan, who puts this completely in the context of the Cold War, who in essence draws a line in the sand in El Salvador and says that this is where global war will be fought, that there will be no social change, no revolution in El Salvador. The U.S. was spending at that time $2.2 million a day to wage war. Leading cause of death is murder.
O sea, la prueba mayor es la pérdida de los seres queridos. Esa es la dificultad mayor.
What happens is that people throughout the world begin to organize against this policy. As North Americans are starting to say no, as they're beginning to understand what's going on.
I'd grown up being told that the United States is a land of freedom and liberty and that we support human rights. And this country, we were destroying any attempt at the building of human rights at all. And we were doing it in a way that was some of the most heinous crimes that were being committed that I, as a North American, couldn't even begin to conceive of, but to read about it, and that was the policy that we were supporting. It was totally against my belief system, and it challenged me to take a response.
La guerra para mí fue una escuela donde aprendí muchas cosas. Aprendí a poder hablar con las personas, a que me entendieran y a entenderlas, a sentir lo que otro sufre. Fue como el 15 de noviembre del 82. Para mí fue una experiencia grande y muy dura a la vez. Me dijeron a mí los compas, a tu cargo van, me dijeron, 800 personas de la población. Tienes que llevarlas a un lugar donde estén fuera de peligro del ejército. Entonces yo dije, yo no conozco el camino, no tenía radio para comunicarme ni nada. Bueno, me fui. Nos atacaron porque los niños lloraban duro, desesperados de hambre, y lloraban. Entonces oyeron los gritos de los niños y se acercaron y nos encorralaron, nos dejaron así y comenzaron a dispararnos con ametralladoras, con fusiles, nos tiraban granadas. La gente gritaba y decía, hoy sí nos mataron, hoy sí ya no vamos a vivir. Y gritaban aquellos niños, papá, me matan. Yo le decía a la gente, caminemos, hay que tener fe que vamos a salir bien, pero no gritemos porque nos van a oír a donde estamos. Se murieron 35 compañeros y compañeras que murieron allí. Y logramos salir con la mayoría de la gente, sí salimos bien. Yo también le digo, yo no creí que iba a quedar viva, yo creí que muerte iba a quedar. Porque las balas me pasaban a las y yo no sé, por gracia de Dios ni una me cayó, salí bien.
In 1984, peasants in El Salvador organized CRIPTAS, the Christian Committee for the Displaced, basically to simply assert their right to be what they were, civilians, and to go back to their communities that they'd been driven from. People are living very desperate lives in refugee camps, hunted, displaced. But there's also this other thing that's going on, is that people are organizing. So out of desperation, but also strength, this concept of sistering is born. Most of the relationships that are developed through the US El Salvador Sister City Network come out of repatriations that come from places like the Mesa Grande refugee camp. What happens with Madison in its relationship with Arcatau is people in Madison began to organize around this concept of sistering and actually had the city council declare itself a sister community with Arcatau. At almost that exact same moment, the military came in and attacked the community of Arcatau.
Aquí ese día 8 de abril de 1986 fue un hecho conmovedor, le diría, un hecho que nos dio dolor, tristeza, sufrimiento, pero a la vez ayudó también a transformar ese dolor en organización y transformarlo en fuerza, en valentía, pues, ¿verdad? A las 5:30 de la mañana vinieron helicópteros, más o menos 15 helicópteros que traían los militares helitransportados. Aparecieron también 2 aviones que eran conocidos como los A-37, eran aviones de guerra. Bombardearon el sector, el alrededor, cayeron los helicópteros y ellos salieron inmediatamente recogiendo toda la gente que encontraban en las casas, ¿verdad? Y decían, bueno, caminen todos para la iglesia, ¿verdad? Nos trajeron a todos, aquí nos contaron a todos, separaron las mujeres en un lado, los niños en otro lado y los jóvenes, los hombres pues en otro lado. Ya cuando estaba todo mundo, digamos, reunido aquí en esta plaza, fue como el lugar, el escenario en donde hubieron disparos, hubo torturas, ahí donde vemos la panadería, hoy era la sala pues de torturas.
They forced the men to go outside, they stripped the men, they took 7 young people out and they shot them.
Y bueno, las mujeres aquí adentro, ¿verdad?, de la iglesia junto con los niños, ellos haciendo oración y ellos con frases vulgares decían, bueno, recen y encomiéndense porque son los últimos minutos de su vida y ya muy poco le falta para que los matemos a todos, ustedes son subversivos, estos cipotes de los niños pequeñitos son los que van a hacer la contrarrevolución, estos también no podemos dejarlos.
And they basically told the community that they would be back, and that they would be back in a very short period of time, and they would kill them all if they didn't leave.
Todos estábamos muy tristes y muy decepcionados cuando nos llegó la noticia, pues, de que estaba, pues, el hermanamiento entre Madison y Arcatao.
What happened at that moment is really quite incredible. The people of Arcatao were informed by the international community of the Red Cross that this community of Madison, Wisconsin had sistered with them. We took out an ad in the newspaper in San Salvador saying that we would hold the government responsible for anything that happened to the people in Arcatao. And this incredible leap of faith takes place because the people of Arcatao have no concept of where Madison, Wisconsin is. This may as well be Mars. I mean, but it's something human. Understand that from their vantage point at that moment, they have no reason to believe that the military won't come back and kill them all. Then they have to make a decision. And incredibly, what they decide is to stay. And of course, the very first thing that we in Madison have to do is to send a delegation, to go to be with these people, to bear witness. The US State Department and the Salvadoran government said over and over that there were no civilians. There were only terrorists. And what we said was very simple. There are civilians, and we can prove that, we can document that, we are with them. Here are the photos. And that's the work that all the sister city projects did.
Well, years ago, Madison had the courage to declare itself a sister city with this faraway and forgotten town.
La hermanización personalmente para mí significa eso, unos hermanos de verdad. Los he sentido y lo he vivido. Y eso es lo más grande de los seres humanos. La más alta conquista no son las cosas materiales. Sí, cuentan, yo no estoy diciendo que no. Pero la más alta conquista del ser humano es tener un amigo de verdad.
US El Salvador Sister City Network is a network of cities around the United States who are sistered with individual rural communities in El Salvador. We organize delegations for people to go down on a regular basis. We organize advocacy campaigns. And finally, we raise money for projects that support organizing in El Salvador.
The traditional sister city model, especially if the one sister was an American city and the other sister was a city in a developing country, was very much a big sister, little sister model. But what's exciting about the US Salvador Sister City projects that are in place is that they're about something much more sophisticated than that. This is not just, wow, what a cute little culture.
A lot of what we're doing is learning how Salvadorans organizing and being inspired by Salvadorans. The Salvadorans recognize and we recognize that they have a very powerful social movement, more powerful and more organized than in many other countries. So there's a lot we can learn from them. If we want to be able to create a worldwide social movement, the way to do it is to start by connecting the social movement in the US with the social movement in El Salvador.
In 1989, you have the collapse of the East Bloc, and Russia as a threat simply is no longer there. The human rights abuses that took place on the part of the Salvadoran military also made it very clear that the war could no longer be sold to the American public. And you have this momentum to end it. And you had the peace accords on January 1st, 1992.
It became obvious to me that even though the end of the war and the signing of the peace accords was a great victory in terms of ending the military conflict and ending the state-sponsored violence, that there were a large number of political and social problems that needed to be addressed in El Salvador.
A esa transición de la guerra a la paz, de la cosa que no es muy fácil poderla entender y poderla traducir a qué tanto se alcanza la paz luego de firmarse, a qué tanto es la democracia. Muy difícil decir que eso se logra, porque estamos dentro de un modelo neoliberal que es asfixiante.
When you hear people in the developing world talk about neoliberalism, And this is a phrase Americans just don't hear that often. We tend to think, you know, my gosh, what are they talking? You know, what's this? The fact of the matter is that people in the developing world have learned very sophisticated economic phrases. They've studied these things because this is what is affecting their day-to-day lives. When you have a neoliberal structuring of the economy, there's this pressure to sell off government-owned entities. So we recently had a situation in El Salvador where there was immense pressure to privatize health services. Now, on the surface, that might seem like a good idea because you say, well, we can bring in Humana or some other big American corporation that can run the hospitals and the clinics and do it far more efficiently than, you know, the old-fashioned bureaucratic government way. And of course, that's the argument being made. But once you privatize the health services in El Salvador, they become a for-profit entity. And the goal of that new privatized health service has to be to make a buck. Well, the best way to make a buck, I can guarantee you, is to close rural clinics. Rural clinics are inefficient. They require you to send doctors and healthcare personnel out to distant areas where you really only treat a handful of people, and these folks can't pay you much, right? So why bother?
What's going on in El Salvador, privatization, is leading to the disequalization of wealth. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer.
Eso hace también de que el movimiento social, las organizaciones, tengamos que seguir buscando cuáles son las alternativas que tenemos dentro de esos espacios que hemos podido conquistar. Espacios que han sido conquistados no así tan fácilmente. Costaron para el caso de El Salvador 70.000 muertos, más de 10.000 desaparecidos, muchos huérfanos y muchos que dejamos nuestra juventud dentro de ese proceso, buscándole una alternativa diferente a ese país.
But the bottom line is, we're not getting better off in this globalized economy. It's not making our lives particularly better. It is making the lives of people in developing countries significantly worse. And so, really, the question is, when do we start getting together?
Bueno, la solidaridad debe de existir solo en tiempos de guerra o debemos de seguir uniendo y estrechando estos lazos de hermandad y de búsqueda de perspectivas y de soluciones. Nos damos por vencidas y cruzamos los brazos y decimos, bueno, ese es el modelo, esa es la política y ya no hay nada más que hacer.
There better be an alternative. There better be another approach, because otherwise we are dooming the vast majority of people in the world to live in poverty, squalor, lack of health care, little hope for their children. I mean, that's not a success, that's not a victory, that's not something to be triumphalist about. We should be desperately seeking after a model that takes us in a better direction. And that's what the US Salvador Sister City Project is about.
I've been working in community work since 1959. Sister Cities, for me, even after so many years of this kind of work, was truly a very transformative experience. The reason is, if I have to characterize US El Salvador Sister Cities, the word that comes to my mind is humility. What I find in working with the people in Sister Cities is that there is such a genuine and sincere feeling of participation, inclusiveness, generosity.
Those bonds of love, friendship, and solidarity are the key to making us better people, to giving us an awareness of how the world functions, and it gives us the moral basis to resist a society, a world that wants to make us individualistic and pit us against one another.
Yo creo que yo disfruto más que cualquier esa hermandad, fíjese. Sí, y yo quisiera que todos la disfrutemos como yo. Pero, pues sí, es una dicha que me dio la vida. Yo la disfruto más. Y bueno, agradezco a la vida que me dio ese gusto.